I wrestle with the idea of limited atonement and utter depravity or total depravity or how evil is man. Let's talk about what the parts to you that make it just unbiblical.
Well, even R.C. Sproul, who's probably the most well-known Calvinist, he's gone on to be with the Lord more recently, but he was a very well-known Calvinist. He helped to influence me in my becoming a Calvinist in the first place with his book Chosen by God, which is a very easy to read, very short book that if you're looking for a representation of Calvinism that's fair, then that would probably be a good starter, a good primer. And I have no problem recommending that people go read Calvinists for themselves. That's only fair for you to listen to the best scholars from their perspective and have them represent themselves. But I would love for people to recognize that you should do the same for us. In other words, if you're going to learn Arminianism, you need to go to a leading, good, scholarly Arminian source. If you're going to learn about provisionism, you need to go to a good provisionist scholar and learn from the sources. But really, what point really led me out of Calvinism theologically was the T, because R.C. Sproul mentions in his book that the T is kind of the foundational point that all of the other points rest upon. And it is the concept and idea of total inability, that all people are born in a condition where they can't respond positively to God's own appeals to be reconciled from their fallen condition. I don't find that anywhere established in the Bible. The passages that Calvinists reference will reference things about their sinfulness of man, which we all agree with. People are sinful and they're in bondage to sin. But the gospel, we believe the gospel is sufficient for those who are in bondage and in sin. And so, in other words, yes, we're sinful. Yes, we're in bondage. Yes, we're at enmity with God. But guess what? He sends a message that sets men free. He sends the gospel, which is sufficient for a lost person to respond to its appeal. And therefore, we're responsible for what we do with the gospel. God hasn't created us or decreed for us to be born in a condition where we can't respond positively to his own truth. And that's where we really push back on the Calvinistic worldview. And the passages, and it'd take a while, and this is one of the reasons I started a broadcast with Soteriology 101 on this topic, was because it takes a while to go through all of the different proof texts that Calvinists will often reference to show where we believe they've made their error. And they'll say, for example, no one's righteous, no, not one, as if we wouldn't agree with that. Oh, of course, we agree. No one is righteous, no, not one. No one seeks after God, they would say. Well, we agree. No one seeks after God, but that doesn't mean we can't respond to God when he seeks us.
Yes.
And just things like that, little small things like that, that you have to just point out for a Calvinist, because they'll quote verse after verse after verse, which says how sinful and depraved we are. And they seem to assume that that means, therefore, we can't respond positively to God's provision for us in that condition. And I don't find that established anywhere in the Bible. I really do believe that God's grace through the gospel is sufficient for lost people. He came to seek and save the lost, and therefore he's going to send a message, i.e. the gospel, that is sufficient for lost people to either accept it or to suppress it. And if they suppress it, that's their fault. It's not a lack of God's provision. It's not because Jesus didn't really die for them. It's not because God, before the foundation of the world, rejected them for some unknown reason. None of those things are ever taught in the Bible. The concept of reprobation isn't even taught anywhere in Scripture. We all have been created in the image of God, and therefore, if anyone perishes, they will perish not for a lack of atonement, not for a lack of provision, not for a lack of love from their Creator. They will perish because they refuse to love the truth so as to be saved, as Paul put it in his letter to the church in Thessalonica. So that's what we're trying to emphasize, is just trying to help people to realize that the foundational view of total inability is not a Christian doctrine originally. It wasn't taught within the first 400 years of the Christian church. It's not seen in the first 400 years except within Gnostic backgrounds, Manichaean backgrounds. The concept of total inability is not founded in Christian doctrine, and it's not in the Scripture. That's our argument, of course. Now, Calvinists would contend with that, but we don't see that concept or that idea of total inability, the concept that we're born unable to respond positively to the gospel. That doesn't exist in any of the writings of the early church until Augustine in the 5th century. So that's why we believe that it's not correct. We believe that it's an error, and it's misleading people to think that we're really not responsible to the gospel, because ultimately we're born unable to respond to the gospel unless God's unilaterally picked us before we were born and irresistibly makes us want to accept him. And that's just not a biblical concept as far as I can tell.